hierarchy and some of the other tools that go along with it, you need to do some kind of configuration and setup in order to get it working. And that's not necessarily obvious when you first sort of download Sakai. So the goal of the presentation today is to tell you what you can do to set it up, and then what you can do with it once you have it set up, and what potentially can be done more in the future with it. So there's this new tool in Sakai 10 called Hierarchy. When you download it, you'll see it in there. So what is it? You can go to the Confluence page where there's a fun description there that's probably written by Aaron that says, the hierarchy service supports general storage of hierarchical nodes within Sakai. It can support multiple hierarchies and has a flexible interface which is meant to be generalized and easy to use. So I think easy to use is sort of I won't go so far as to call it a misnomer, but it's in the eye of the beholder. So the thing with hierarchy is it, on its own, as a Sakai tool, it provides no front-end interface. So it's all behind the scenes. So you need some other mechanism in order to utilize it. And I think that's probably the thing that would throw people off first. But the idea behind the hierarchy, and this is the part sort of conceptually that I wanted to spend a little bit of time on, is when we use the term hierarchy, we're talking about putting things into essentially a tree-like structure. So you have something at the top, and then there are children, and there are grandchildren, and you have this branching tree-like structure. That's images I'll show you in a second. With hierarchy, the hierarchy tool just provides the platform to be able to create these tree-like structures, but it does not dictate that the members of that structure need to be anything specific. In the examples that we're going to be looking at, the members of the tree are usually course sites, but they can technically be anything, which is why this description is so non-specific. And it can be used in different ways and has been used in different ways in Sakai. But now, as of Sakai 10, we're sort of starting to move, at least at Longsight, towards a recommended path. But there are obviously lots of different ways to do it. So the takeaway here is that a hierarchy service provides no front-end user interface on its own, but can be very powerful when you want to put things into some kind of organized structure. And you can create multiple different hierarchies for different things. But our recommendation, if you follow sort of what I'm going to lay out here, is you'll probably only just have one hierarchy. But it's important to keep in mind that that's not the only hierarchy that there necessarily has to be. So at most institutions, you have some. This is just an image I found off the internet. Local University is not a client of ours. In most universities, you have some kind of organizational structure, right? So you have, if you're a big university, you have colleges, you have institutes, then you have departments, you might have sub-departments. At Columbia, they even subdivide their departments into subject codes. But the order and sort of way that the tree looks in your brain is going to be different from institution to institution. But everybody has this. And then at some point, when you get down to the lowest level, you're going to be talking about individual course offerings for a particular semester, right? So the whole idea behind the way that we use hierarchy and some of the tools you're going to see right now is to take this concept that we have in our minds of the organizational structure of the institution and represent that in Sakai. Because if you think of Sakai, when you log into Sakai and you go to worksite setup, you say, give me list all the courses. It's just a giant bucket to Sakai. It's just like, here's a bunch of courses. By default, the only real categorization you have is by site type. So is it a course site or a project site or a portfolio site? And then for courses specifically, what term is it associated with? You get that, you get term, but that's it, right? And you might be able to look at the site ID or the title of a particular course and say, oh, I know, that's biology, or that's Professor so-and-so's class, or I know that this class is a big lecture because of our naming convention at our institution. But Sakai isn't knowledgeable about that. It's just bits, Sakai. It's just like, here's the title. It means nothing to me, but I'm sure it means something to you. So the goal is to either look at those site titles or look in SAS or wherever the data is, and ideally, hopefully, it's somewhere and not just in your own brain, and then represent that in Sakai. So then we can do stuff with that information. So this is a very simple example, but maybe your institution looks something more like this. So the goal with hierarchy, implementing hierarchy for the kinds of things we actually need to use it for in these examples, we want it to be able to have it be very, very flexible because there's lots of different ways that an institution can be organized. So most often, oh no. Now we're skipping too far ahead, okay. So as I was saying, mostly you're just setting up a hierarchy of course sites to map your institutional sort of structure of how those course sites are understood at your university. We wanted to keep it really flexible, so you can have as many levels as you want. So at a small school, sometimes we just have, name of the school, name of the institution, and then maybe there's departments, and then course sites under that. It's very simple. At bigger institutions, we're going to have a lot of different levels, a lot of different levels of specificity. And so with hierarchy, you can have as many as you want. The default, and you'll see this in a later slide, but the default is 4 levels. So the default is school, department, subject, and then term. Term you get automatically. And that's what it's going to expect by default. But you can change that, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. But one of the takeaways, and this is again in the later slide, is that right now, even though we wanted to make it as flexible as possible, the limitations of the hierarchy tool is that a thing cannot be the child of more than one, cannot be the direct child of more than one node in the tree. So the reason why this comes up is for cross-listed courses. So, if you have courses that are combined or what have you, as long as there's just one site in Sakai, then it's fine. But let's say that site is cross-listed, and it's really half a biology course and half a medical school course or something like that. Ideally, you may want to have that course be in both places in the tree. Right now, you cannot do that. And so what does that mean for implementation? It means that thinking forward to how we're going to use hierarchy, that will help us figure out where this course should go in the hierarchy. It can only go in one place. So it helps us be a little bit more strict about how we organize our hierarchy. But when we look at the examples, then you guys might have more questions about how to handle certain situations. So the reason why hierarchy is now part of core, because it's existed for a long time, it's been used by the evaluation system for a long time, and we'll talk about that. But the main reason for that is because delegated access moved into core. And delegated access is a newer tool that we originally developed for Columbia University, but it's something that was needed in the Sakai community for a long time. Out of the box in Sakai up until now, you only had administration workspace. So you could add people to administration workspace where they were super powerful, or they could get nothing. And there were certain workarounds, sort of junior admin type approaches that you could take, fiddling with realm permissions, but there was even with that, it was an all or nothing thing when it came to being able to access the courses without being enrolled in them. How can we delegate access to representatives from different schools? So let's say I have somebody from the medical school, I have someone from the law school, or someone from a particular institute. I want to make it so that they can go into any courses in that department or school without having to be enrolled in them and without having to go through me. So that was the goal of the delegated access tool. It's an extremely robust tool, and you can do a lot of really interesting things with it. But in order to utilize it properly, you need to set up a hierarchy, which is why I'm doing this presentation. Because we have this crazy, amazing, robust tool that's now going to be part of Sakai 10 by default, but unless you know how to set it up, it's going to be useless to you. So the first thing that you need to do in order to get delegated access up and running is you have to be able to set up that hierarchy. So how do you do that? So as I said before, you get school, department, and subject, and then term for free. So you already have term on all your course sites already. But we need to get that school, department, and subject, or whatever your particular structure is going to be, set up. So how do we do that? Delegated access uses site properties as the interface for setting these configurations. So the idea here is that if you think about all the course sites in your system, if you go into the Sites tool in Administration Workspace, like for example, if you're adding a stealth tool or something like that, you'll see that the site itself actually has some what are called site properties. These are just name value pairs that are stored in the database for the site. So you'll see if you go in and look at a particular example course in your instance, you'll already see that the term is already there. Term is a site property. That's one you get for free when you create the course site. So you'll see that'll already be in there. But we need to add school, department, and subject. So now you can go into the Sites tool and add those properties manually. Just a new property. Name, school, value, business. Add new property. Name, department, value, whatever it is, accounting. And you can go in there and put in those manually. Capitalization does count, so keep that in mind for the name and the value. And so you can do that manually. And if you were to do that manually, once you had that set on all your course sites, then you could go into the job scheduler, and you can set up, there's a job that's available for you to be able to set up called Delegated Access Site Hierarchy Job. You can turn that on, and when you run it, it will look at all the course sites in your system. It will look for those site properties that you added, and it will say, okay, well, I have this many schools, I have this many departments, and I have this many subjects, and it will construct the hierarchy. It will inspect these properties and figure out what the hierarchy should look like. So you don't build the hierarchy manually. You set the important information on each course site, and then Sakai builds that hierarchy based on that data. So a lot of times we have folks who, I mean, there's a slide later about talking about changing your hierarchy, because sometimes you need to, and sometimes people will see artifacts of the old setup that they had, or some courses are still showing up in the wrong place. And so what you need to do is go find those sites that have the errant, site properties associated with them, track them down, fix the site properties, rerun the job, and then everything is pretty. But we'll talk about that more in a second. So by default, Sakai is expecting school, department, subject. So if you follow that mechanism and then you run the job, it will build the hierarchy for you. If you want a different setup, if you just want school and department and no subject, or if you want something completely different, the way that you tell Sakai that is you need to set some Sakai properties. By default, it will use these ones, and you don't need to send any Sakai properties. But if you want different ones, you have to set Sakai properties. If you go to the Delegated Access Confluence page, it has some amazing documentation written by my colleague Brian, and a lot of detail, super duper helpful. So I highly recommend that. And that shows all the different Sakai properties that you can set. It has like common issues and how to troubleshoot them, a bunch of really good stuff on there. So the other thing is, well, I don't really want to go in and add these site properties manually. That's for chumps. Who would do that? So the way that we usually address this in our hosting environment is we try to piggyback off whatever the site creation process is. And so that's why when I'm trying to, when we have clients who want to set this kind of thing up, the first thing I say is, okay, the first thing you have to do is think about your hierarchy and think about how it's going to look and how we're going to be able to look at a particular course site and know where it fits into that hierarchy. Because they know, that they've internalized all these rules about like, well, if it starts with a B, then it's this, and if it has these numbers in it, then it's this. They already know that. I don't know that. So in order to help them set up the proper scripts to apply the proper site properties, I need to understand that information. But you have an advantage because you already know all that information, ideally. But it can be a good way to sort of ferret out some of the weird edge cases in your institution. So, some institutions I've worked with have a very strict and well understood naming convention and categorization convention for their sites. And some are sort of like making it up as they go along for some of our smaller liberal arts schools. So, if that's the case for you, it can be a good motivator to get everybody all on the same page when it comes to these conventions. It's like, look, if you want to be able to have access to administrate your department's courses in Sakai, then you need to get on board with some kind of consistent naming structure for your courses, and then I can give you that. There's a little carrot and stick kind of thing going on. So how do we piggyback off the SIS creation process? For our hosted clients, we use web services to create course sites based on their SIS data. So we have an opportunity at that point to use a web service to apply a site property after we create the course. So we know what all the rules are. When we know it's time to create a new course, there's a web service that creates a new course, and then if that's successful, the next thing we do is say, okay, what's the site title, what's the site ID, what site properties do we need to apply so that it can fit into the hierarchy. If you create your courses a different way, then you might need some other mechanism, and I could probably brainstorm with you different ways to do it. But it's going to be different for every institution depending on how your courses are created. And then there's a job to run. So as I mentioned before, there's the Delegated Access Site Hierarchy job, and you just need to go in there and run that, and it'll go and construct your whole hierarchy. If you've added a bunch of new site properties, and this is the first time you're doing it, it's going to take a little while for the job to run. Probably maybe a couple hours if you have a really big institution and you've just changed, like, thousands of course sites. We usually run the site hierarchy job every night to pick up any changes, like new courses that have been added to the hierarchy, course might have been recategorized. Anytime you update a site property on a site, either via the GUI or via web services, it's going to change the site modified date. And that's what the site hierarchy job looks at. It says, okay, when we're running it every night to pick up changes, the way that it detects changes, it says, okay, all of you sites, have you been modified recently? And the site says, I've been modified recently. So it says, okay, what's your change? What's going on with you? And then updates the hierarchy. If you go directly to the database, which is very tempting to do, and just add in these properties, because they're just name value pairs, super easy to add to the database, that is not going to update the site modified date. So if you've never run the hierarchy job before, that's fine. So if this is your first time, you got a zillion sites to update, you want to just put them into the database, that's fine. Do that. Run the job. Once you run the job for the first time, though, it's going to remember the last time it ran. And so it's going to say, did any of you get updated between last time I ran and now, since the last time I checked? And if it, nobody says me, then it's not going to make any updates. So if you do make changes directly in the database, and that site modified property does not get updated, then you're going to have to go in and change the delegated access job last ran date to be sometime further back since it's changed, so that it'll pick it up and add that site. So the moral of the story is, don't really do this in the database unless you really feel like you have to, because it's going to make more work for you. So once you have this hierarchy built out in Sakai, how do you know that it's working? How do you know what it looks like? How do you make sure it's right? And then what do you do with it? So you can go to the Delegated Access tool, and the way the Delegated Access works is that the whole idea here is that you want to grant access to specific users to particular parts of your hierarchy. So when you're an administration workspace member, if you're an all-powerful admin, when you first come to the Delegated Access tool, you're not necessarily going to see anything right away. So the way that I will double check is I'll search for a user, like test user, just if I just want to check out the hierarchy, make sure it looks okay. Search for a test user, or potentially search for a user you actually are going to grant access to something for. And then once you start to find the user that you want, then now it's going to show you the hierarchy. And so at the root here we have Sakai. That might be Sakai, it might be whatever your branded institutional name is, Courseworks or whatever, Chef, whatever. And then underneath that, you're going to see the structure that you've indicated. So we have a simpler structure here. So you can see it's just Sakai, and then it's these particular departments, and then we have terms. So a more simpler setup, because it would fit better on the slide. And then you can go in at any level. So depending, I could even grant, oh no, there's a booby trap. So I can even grant access up at this top level. And why would I want to do that? Because the whole point here is delegated access, right? So maybe I want to do that because I have like help desk students, and I want them to be able to access everything, but I want to control it a lot more tightly than just giving them access to administration workspace. And we'll talk in a second about why this is a better approach for student help desk workers. So, or I can go in at any of these levels. This is not good. I'm going to trip on this at least 8 more times. I can go into any of these levels and grant the access. So I could do it at the term level if I wanted to, although I probably wouldn't. And then site access is the column that I care about first and foremost. So I'm going to grant them access to the sites. And then I have this user becomes option. And this is going to pull up all the template realms. And you can restrict this list if you find it too confusing, you want to pare it down. So it's going to show you, so the standard one that I would use is instructor site template course. That's the standard instructor role that every course is going to get out of the box. It's only going to show these realm IDs in parentheses if there's more than one realm with that role in it, which you probably will have. But. And then you pick, so this is going to say, for this particular user that I'm granting access to, when they access these particular courses in the hierarchy, when they go into those courses, they're going to essentially be as if they were this role. They're not enrolled, but those are the permission sets that they'll get. And then once you select that, it's inherited. So I can say it at any level, and I can set what the access is, and you'll see the interface will change. It's very pretty with jQuery, and it'll show you that it's inherited. You can make exceptions on a case-by-case basis further down the tree if you want to. And then you have this capability to restrict tools. So this is kind of why I like to use this approach for student help desk workers, even if I'm giving them access to everything, because I can still restrict tools. So I can say you can't have access to the gradebook at all. You don't even see that. And then also the other nice takeaway is sometimes people ask us, well, if I have delegated access permission to a particular site, but I'm also a student in that site, like in the case of a help desk worker, who wins? And specifically because of that use case, we made a rule that your role in the site wins. So you might have administrative access or instructor access to all these course sites, but in the one that you're a student, you're just a student, you don't get administrative access in that site. Because we felt like if we're explicitly granting the user a certain role, that should take precedence over any sort of inherited permission they have.
Quick question so that I understand what I'm seeing. So the node tree here is within the delegated access tool within the administration workspace. But you would set default hierarchy was school department subject. I'm not seeing school department subject mapped to that hierarchy there.
Yeah, so in this particular case, we have a simpler hierarchy here. We changed it.
Okay.
But the default would be that, yes. This is just a more stripped down version.
School term.
Yeah, very simple, exactly. So you could do a simple approach like this getting started if you wanted to. You would just have to set Sakai.property settings to tell it, we're not going to use the default approach, we're going to use school term approach, which is
and I'm looking at properties and delegated access and conflict very detailed.
Yeah.
The issue though then is that if you start simple and then you want to change, then you have to go about changing the properties and then redoing your
yeah, so I have a bullet point later in this presentation about what do you do when you need to completely change your hierarchy, which has happened a couple times already with some hardware.
I anticipate what's the fun.
Yeah. So there's a lot of other fun things you can do. So with restrict tools, you can say you have access as an instructor except these particular tools that I don't want you to see. And there's all kinds of other fun stuff that you can do. You'll see that there's also two more columns here, site access admin and shopping admin. So access admin is relevant to our conversation here. So let's say you had, what are we looking at? Law school, right? And let's say law school is really wealthy because it's a really good law school and they have a lot of donors. And they have like a whole host of support people over there that just deal with law school people. Maybe they have like 5 or 6 people, and they're always bringing on new students all the time. There's a lot of turnover. You don't want to have to go in and grant each person and then remove, and then they have to go through you every time they hire a new student. If you give one of those people, like the head of the department, access admin, then they can add and remove their own people to their own area. So you're basically not only delegating the administration of those sites, but you're delegating the administration of delegating the administration of those sites. Say that 5 times fast. But the idea is that then they don't have to go through you whenever they want to add, and they can only grant access as much as they themselves have. So like if I only have read access to all the law school courses, I can't grant instructor access to my student because I don't have that permission myself. So, and then shopping admin is a separate tool. Shopping period is a separate tool, which I have another slide on, but if people are interested in it, click on. So once you have this set up and you grant somebody access, then they're going to need delegated access tool in their My Workspace so that they can actually get in. They'll see the hierarchy. They can expand it just like you can here. They just see this bar stuff. They just see this. And then they can go in and access any of those sites. Is there a question?
I walked in a little late, so I can look you first. I'm not sure how you get the school part. Because we use support a load.
Yeah.
And I know those files pretty good. There's no school code.
Yeah. So I think the question is half what's going on at your institution and what decisions you want to make institutionally, and then half how do I represent that in Sakai. So you don't necessarily have to have a school in there. It just depends on what you want your hierarchy to look like.
I do want school in there,
but it's not in your data.
It's not in. Well, it's in the data on the sys. I'm not sure how.
Oh, it's not coming through on Sakura.
Yeah. There's no field in Sakura for school.
Yeah. Well, that is a problem.
Where would I put it? How could I put it manually?
Yeah, so if you want to put it in, so essentially at the end of the day, these settings, like what's my school, what's my department, those are all site properties. So you can go into the site tool and add them manually if you wanted to. Or you could have some kind of script that sort of goes around Sakura and just says, okay, get the schools for these courses and put them into Sakai. You can script adding site properties with web services.
Okay.
So then the student, they go into My Workspace, they see delegated access. There is capability in here so that when you add somebody, grant somebody delegated access, the delegated access tool gets automatically added to their My Workspace, so you don't have to worry about that, adding that. And then they'll see the hierarchy, they can go in, they can click on anything and go into the course. Don't need to be enrolled.
Must delegated access be added to this individual person's My Workspace, or could you create a site where you enroll people in the delegated access tool, so that way you can maintain groups of people who have delegated access?
Yeah, you could, they just need access to the delegated access tool somewhere. So you could definitely do it that way. If using a project site would be helpful in a way because you could provide context and links to other materials all in one place. So yeah, you could do it that way too. You don't have to add it to My Work.
I did that with analysis.
Yeah, so we'll go back to shopping period in a second because I don't have a screenshot for it. So the other, and I want to make sure we talk about evaluation system at the time we have. The other place where you can use hierarchy is the evaluation system. That's where it was originally used. And so now that we have this mechanism for representing the hierarchy in Sakai, and we've done all the hard work of trying to understand what our hierarchy is and getting that into Sakai, now there's other places where we might want to use that hierarchy, namely evaluation system. So we had an evaluation system presentation earlier today where we talked about this. One of the drawbacks of the evaluation system, unfortunately, is that out of the box, you have to be enrolled in every site that you want to deploy an evaluation to. And that wasn't necessarily intentional, but it's the way things are right now. We would like to have an interface where people can search for sites and then deploy evaluations to it, but that doesn't exist right now. So for folks who are doing evaluation system in a bigger way, we utilize the hierarchy to grant permissions for people to deploy evaluations to core sites they're not necessarily enrolled in. So this is going to talk about how we do that. So in order to tell evaluation systems, so one of the reasons why I harped on at the beginning the fact that hierarchy, there can be multiple hierarchies, is because if you do nothing, if you go into evaluation system, in evaluation system, there is actually an interface for manually building your hierarchy for evaluation system if you want to. I don't think anybody would ever want to do this because then you would have to keep keeping it up to date. And there's just so much overhead, it would be pointless. Because it's all manual, you can't script it, it's too hard to put in the database. So instead what we did is rather than having evaluation system create its own hierarchy, we want to tell evaluation system to use the same hierarchy that we already built out for delegated access. So in order to do that, we have to install this little connector piece, which is this link right here. This is a special, so evaluation system has these two providers. One is called evaluation group provider, and the other is called evaluation hierarchy provider. This is an implementation of evaluation hierarchy provider that basically just tells evaluation system, look at delegated access hierarchy, use that hierarchy. And it's in real time, too. So as changes are made to that hierarchy, you'll see them represented in EvalSys. But you need to install that in order for it to work. So when you're in evaluation system and you go to deploy an evaluation to a bunch of courses, you have these three options. If you don't see the hierarchy nodes option, it's probably because you need to turn on hierarchy in the administrate panel. There's a checkbox for it. And so you basically have three options. Eval groups is just pick from course sites that you're already enrolled in, which we've already talked about how that can be limiting after a while. Ad hoc group is just put in a list of people, but the hierarchy nodes piece is the one that now, once we have that connector piece installed, we can now utilize. And so if you open up that section, what you'll see is something like this. So now we've opened up hierarchy nodes, and now we can open and close these areas. This is a different hierarchy than what we saw before, sorry about that. You can open and close these different sections, and then select the ones you want. Now, in the case of evaluation system, term really comes into play here. Because when you are deploying course evaluations, term is really important. You only want to deploy course evaluations to the particular term that students should be evaluating. In the case of delegated access, when you're granting access to people, term is not so important. You kind of want them to have access to older terms because instructors might have content back there. You know, you're giving them access to everything for that department, not term specific. Here it is term specific. So when we talk about changing hierarchies, we have one client who doesn't use delegated access but uses this pretty extensively. And so they set up a situation like this initially with term at the bottom. And then after using it one round for course evaluations, they decide they actually wanted to invert it. So what they have now is Sakai and then terms, so like spring 2014, then departments and subjects underneath that. And so what that allows them to do is that then they can select the whole term, all the courses across all their departments for one term, rather than having to go into each department and select the term. Because when you come in here, wherever you check a box, it's going to deploy this evaluation to all the courses underneath that. So it's going to drill down to every single course that could possibly be selected. You know, so if I check nursing, it's going to get every single nursing course, including maybe ones for previous semesters that I don't want. We did work on a customization for Columbia, I think, which did not make it back into the community code base, I don't think, where you actually have a drop down at the top where you can say, I only want spring 2014, and then it'll filter those out, which is something that we should get back into. So you don't have to completely change your whole hierarchy in order to use it that way. So, and right now, the way it works is when I check arts and science, it's going to deploy to all those arts and science courses, and I can't really make exceptions. Like I can't say all the arts and science courses except for this one. I can't do that right now. I have to go in. I can go in and expand this all the way down and just pick individual courses if I want to. I don't have to be enrolled in them to do that, so that's nice. But there's no way for me to say all of arts and science except this one course. So, like I said before, the structure of the delegated access hierarchy is synced with evaluation system. They use the same structure, but the permissions are different. So, if I grant delegated access permission to a particular person, Susie, let's say, to all of the law school courses, that does not mean that she has access to do anything in evaluation system for those law school courses. I can grant her that access, but it's separate. It's different. And this seems to work okay for most people. This seems to be the way that people prefer to have it, because the people who are doing course evaluations might not necessarily help desk people, might not be the same people. So if I want to grant permission to Susie to deploy evaluations to all the law school courses, the place that I need to go to do that is I need to go to evaluation system, administrate, and there's an option in the top called control hierarchy. This is another place where I can see what the hierarchy looks like. So if you've just installed that DA eval provider connector and you want to make sure it's working, you can come in here and see it, and you should see the same thing you see in delegated access, and that's how you'll know it's working. And so then once we come in here and we, see it's working, we've got our courses in here. The way that I can grant access to Susie to deploy evaluations to all the courses is I come in here and I find whatever level she is. So if she's law school, I find law school, whatever it is. Then I come all the way over here to assign users, and I click the assign users next to the level at which I want to grant her access. And then I'm presented with this nice interface where I can put in her user ID and then say what kind of permission she should have to the hierarchy. Right now, assign evaluation. See, I told you. Assign evaluation is the only one that really does anything. So these other options, sometimes people say, well, what does view node and control node really mean? And I'm like, I have no idea because it doesn't do anything. So nothing, it means nothing. I think there was a vision of it doing something. Maybe if you've built out your hierarchy manually, you can delegate other people to maintain it for you. But in this case, that's sort of irrelevant because we're not doing that. It's all happening automatically anyway. So the permission that you really care about here is assign evaluation. Once you grant that permission to the person, then when they need access to the evaluation system tool. So you need to grant them that in their My Workspace or in project site or something like that. And then once they can get into evaluation system, they can deploy evaluations to that slice of the hierarchy. They only see, as with delegated access, they only see the piece that they have permission to. And so then, now, they can all take care of their own course evaluations and they'll never call you again, ideally. So FYI, there are some things that it does not do. I've mentioned some of them already. We mentioned this in the evaluation system presentation. Right now, hierarchy is only used in evaluation system for assigning evaluations. Once the assignment part of it is all over and the evaluation is deployed, hierarchy is not really consulted ever again. So once the evaluation is going, it'll say, this evaluation is deployed to like 150 course sites. And if you click on that link, you'll just basically see the list of course sites it's deployed to. Sometimes you'll see it in the hierarchy, but it's not really extensively used. I would like to see it used for reporting, and we've had requests for that before. So people could say, roll me up a report of all their evaluation responses on a department-by-department basis. And maybe those people who I granted permission to can see that report on their own, even if they didn't create the evaluation. But right now, that's not there. Again, as I said, sites can't be in more than one place in the hierarchy, so that's problematic for people. But we found a way to work around it most of the time, so if you have something that's really stumping you, just send an email to the evaluation system list or send me an email. And then we talked about what happens when the structure needs to be changed midstream. So like in the case with this particular client, after using the hierarchy, they realized that they wanted something completely different. And that happens because sometimes people have trouble conceptualizing like the application of this sort of abstract data structure until they actually start using it. So when we have to change things midstream, a lot of times this doesn't mean just changing a few site properties here and there. It means like a complete overhaul. In that case, it depends on how bad it is. Sometimes I do go to the database because it's just easier. And if I do that, then I can get it all set up the way I want in the database, but the site properties are not going to get updated. So what I need to do is there's an entry in the database for the delegated access job, and there's information about it on the Confluence page. So there's pointers specifics. But there's a table that just has one entry that basically just keeps track of the last time the job ran. And so that's, you're going to need to update that. It's like I'll update the Confluence page with the exact, like what you need to put in there. But you'll see it's a random, it looks like a random string of numbers. It's actually a Unix timestamp for the last time it ran. So you can, update that or take out the entry completely, and then it'll regenerate everything. But I want to add some more tips and tricks to the Confluence page, but the Confluence page will point you in the right direction. I think it's under the last section on the page is all about, troubleshooting issues, and I think there's a section there for it. So if you do run into problems with redoing your hierarchy, send out an email, send out a, distress signal, and we'll help you out. But be aware that sometimes when you do have to go to the database to update that hierarchy, you're going to need to update that last job ran date in order for it to pick up those changes. Any other questions?
So just wanted to rewind a little bit, thinking about what you said. There can only be one hierarchy for a site?
A site can only live in one place in the hierarchy, in the delegated access or evaluation system hierarchy.
Right, because the optimal analysis hierarchy is sort of at odds with what would be the optimal delegated access hierarchy. So this means at some point we need to make a decision about what it is we want to support if we decide to use the hierarchy.
Yeah, so I mean, if you find that that's the case at your institution, and maybe it is, you don't have to have them use the same hierarchy. You can do your own implementation of a val hierarchy provider, or you can build out your hierarchy manually and have it be different than the one that you use in delegated access.
The other alternative is that you can roll a role account in those sites that you can provide a hierarchy, use that role account to deploy applications to those sites in question.
Yeah, we've created, for some of the clients that weren't ready to dive into the implementation of a hierarchy, we said, okay, an interim short-term measure is just make like a valuation administrator, like generic account, and enroll that in everything so it doesn't, pollute your own personal enrollments, and use that. And that's been used as sort of like an interim measure until they're ready to dive more fully into use it.
Is there any plans to make, by default, allow a node to have more than one parent or one set of parents?
Yeah, I mean, it's been something that's been requested. I think the problem that I have is I don't know exactly how that would work or what it would mean for that node. I think the problem is really going to be deep within some of the assumptions that hierarchy is making. So I think it's a question if people are really serious about wanting to support that work, then we would start getting to a point where we start to seriously think about, okay, what kind of effort level would be required. But I don't think anybody's at that point willing to do that yet.
Well, case in point, you brought up the use case where a student was a member of a course for which they also have delegated access.
Mm-hmm.
So therefore, which permissions role should precedence? If a site were a member of more than one destination node, which delegated access rights
Yeah.
precedence?
Yeah, and it's like, in the case of a student being enrolled in a course, that's a fundamentally different kind of thing than getting delegated access granted. So we can make some value judgments there, and we can think about use cases, and we can try to pick the one that we think is most appropriate. But when potentially if a site is under two different places in the hierarchy, especially if they're at the same level, they're sort of equivalent in my mind, so I wouldn't know what kind of judgment call to make there about how to handle it.
This slide deck is the one that you.
I will put it up afterwards, yes, definitely.
So if I have courses that are offered at an interdisciplinary level across the entire college, so let's say that's at 12, and I want to assign everything else in the department, I assign them at the college level in the hierarchy?
Yes, I mean, it depends on how you have your hierarchy set up. So if I knew that I had this whole host of interdisciplinary courses, I might create a separate part of the hierarchy just for them, so I could grant access to them differently and separately. But you could definitely grant people an access at a higher level if you want to make sure that they had two different sort of things underneath them.
About evaluation.
Yeah. I guess it depends. I don't know. Does that answer your question, or kind of? I mean, do you?
One of those play around with it.
Yeah. I mean, I'm more than happy to take a look at anything in specific if you have. It's hard to talk abstractly. Yeah, Matt.
Talking abstractly, what's between here with hierarchy and reporting evaluations?
Making it happen?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like I said in the evaluation system session, it really just depends on where, you were there, you had your own list of stuff. Like, everybody's got stuff they want in an evaluation system, but very few are available to work on it. So it just is a question of figuring out, okay, how are we going to support this work, and then how do we as a community prioritize the work?
Okay, so it's code that has to be written, not like some assumptions made that have to be unpacked or anything like that.
I mean, I do think, like I said in the presentation this morning, I do think that it would be helpful to have, I'm just the person who types in the code, all the use case stuff and the application and how it's actually used at your institution, that's the part that people can help fill in that doesn't require technical skill. So, if somebody wanted to, somebody like you maybe, if somebody wanted to come up with mock-ups or a proposal for how it would work and what it would look like, that would definitely be the first step. So that would be helpful. We would not turn that work away. The question it would provide us with a way to discuss it and figure out if we're all on the same page. But then the second part is, okay, well, how are we going to make this actually happen? And that's part still unresolved.
I just find it's not square pegs or not holes. It's just that.
Yeah, I think it's just labor at this point, provided that we can come to a shared understanding of how it should work. And I think in this case, we probably can. There are other things in evaluation system where it's just like people are really far apart. But on this, not much. Any other questions?
Is there a slide for contact information?
No, but I can put it. Rebecca?
Yeah, sort of a half comment, half question. So, tell me if I'm incorrect, but sort of an FYI comment I have about hierarchy for analysis. It's the lowest level you can go to the course site. So if you're deploying evaluations, you can't drill down to instructors or TAs that you want to be evaluated. So you just have to make sure you have everybody assigned correctly in the course site before you deploy that evaluation, because there's no way for you to check an evaluation system when you're using hierarchy as to who's about to be evaluated. Because of that, we ended up using a different way where you go by course site and then you choose who gets evaluated.
Yeah, there's that feature when you're doing the eval groups option, there's a feature that shows you the instructors and the TAs, and then you can sort of pick a subset if you want to.
So that's what we went with.
And we don't have that in hierarchy, and that has been requested. That's another feature.
List, right?
Yeah, that was already on the wish list before.
Yeah.
But my mental wish list, I don't know if it was on the Confluence page, but yeah, that's definitely on there. And then also people mentioned the ability to drill down to groups with insights and evaluate that, and so that should be on the list too. There's something else I was going to say. Oh yeah, we don't really have a lot of time, but shopping period, I'll just throw it out there because it's technically part of delegated access, but it's not officially been announced as like, okay, this is in Sakai 10, but it's basically there. You just have to turn it on. Although Brian and I was actually asking Brian, how do you actually turn it on? And I wasn't like 100% clear on the answer, so I think I know. But if you're curious, you could ask me. Basically, the idea with shopping period, again, this is part of what we developed for Columbia, was that after we had this whole delegated access set up, they have a system at Columbia where students can essentially shop for courses during the drop add period. And they wanted to be able to make it easy for the students to not just see the syllabi of these courses, but actually go into the courses and essentially access them almost as like an auditor, without necessarily being enrolled through their SIS system. So the shopping period tool allows the students to search all the courses in the system, and the ones which they are allowed to see, they can go into any of them and then see the tools that they're allowed to see in there. So that shopping period admin column that you saw before, that I said we talk about later if there was time, this middle column, shopping period admin, what that does is, if I grant that to somebody, that allows them to, for any course in this part of the hierarchy, set the shopping permissions for that course. So is it available to be shopped? Can students see it? And then once they can go into it, what do they see if they're just shopping? So I can restrict tools and do a lot of other fun stuff. So, that's because Columbia has a very distributed model where every school and department wants to do its own special thing. So, and that's a common thread, I think, for a lot of institutions. So this allows the shopping period admins to say, our courses are not going to participate in this, or they are, and if so, this is what we allow in our department.
So you have to add every student then? Somebody has to add every student into your shopping?
No. So shopping period has essentially two roles, pseudo roles, unauthenticated and essentially authenticated. So the idea is that a student who is shopping would either be just like a random person from the universe, no login, we know nothing about them, or they might have logged in to say, I'm a Columbia person, but that's as much as we know, let's say. So when the shopping period admin decides whether or not this course or these group of courses is going to participate in the shopping period, they can also set, is the course available at all to anyone other than people who are enrolled? No. If it is available, who is it available to for shopping? Just people who log in with their Columbia unis, or the whole wide world? And so they can set that. So if you want to enable that, or you're more curious about that, there is documentation about shopping period on the Confluence page. The Delegated Access page has information about both tools, but if you want to enable it in 10, come find me later, because I think I know how you do it, but I haven't actually tested it myself, so there might be more to it than I think. Any other questions? Thank you, and I will put these slides online.